Trigger warning. This program contains detailed descriptions of historical torture and violence. If that may be harmful to you, please consider watching later. The year is 1478. Beneath the marble face of the ducal palace, a narrow stone chamber smells of damp and iron. Water drips somewhere in the dark. Giovanni Boromeo hangs from a rope. His shoulders sit strangely in their sockets, one arm limp, the other twitching. He is alive, barely. His lips whisper a name we no longer understand. This is not an accidental scene of brutality left to chance by brute men. It is precision under a roof, a clerk's notation, an examiner's record, a torturer's log. This is the result of systems, procedures, and a kind of hideous craftsmanship. These 20 medieval torture methods will change your view on history forever because they reveal something museums and romantic paintings avoid: cruelty converted into craft, pain administered according to manuals, and suffering written into law. What looks like chaos is often the work of bureaucracies. What looks like improvisation is often the product of training, routine, and deliberate social engineering. If you value history that challenges what you think you know, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is a careful, evidence-based examination, and we will move slowly through each method and what it meant for real people. 1. Sleep deprivation. The Vigil. Vignette. Isabella de Cordoba arrived at dawn, urine-keen and hollow-eyed after 3 nights without more than a handful of bread. Her ankles showed the pale abrasion of ropes. Her face had the hollow hollows of long wakefulness. A court scribe recorded her muttering at the interrogator's table, names blurred and repeated until the language itself frayed. She was not starved for food only. She had been starved of sleep until she could no longer separate memory from invention. Function and mechanism. Sleep deprivation was not an improvisational cruelty. Manuals and prison logs describe shifts of attendance and rotating watches to prevent even short naps. The physiology is plain. Prolonged wakefulness frays attention and short-circuits reasoning. It breaks the boundaries of time, weakens willpower, and increases suggestibility. Used as an interrogation technique, exhaustion made confessions more likely without leaving the immediate visible marks of beating. As a punishment, it was also a slow, existential kind of torment. Victims were robbed of the one private refuge human beings possess: evidence. A number of court records from the late 15th century record vigils ordered by magistrates. Prison registers note attendance assigned in rotations, and later forensic work on skeletal remains of long-term detainees implies prolonged stress and sleep-disrupted lifestyles. Witness testimonies emphasize confusion and false memory as common results.
Consequence. The result was often confession regardless of guilt, lasting cognitive impairment, and a social humiliation that could be reported in public registers, proof that the accused had been broken, not necessarily that they had done wrong. 2. The Pair of Anguish. Vignette. Marguerite of Lyon sat in a dim cell clutching her skirts while the day guard read aloud the magistrate's charge. The Pair of Anguish itself never appeared in the public square for show. It was the subject of whispers, designed to be inserted, expanded in secrecy, and to deliver a terror that left no record easy to describe in open court. Marguerite's testimony in the record is short. "They told me I would be made small," she wrote, a line that reads like a witness to the weapon's threat more than its detail. Function and mechanism. The pair, an object mentioned in several inquisitorial manuals, functioned less as a machine and more as a psychological and sexualized instrument of humiliation and pain. Contemporary references suggest variants used orally, vaginally, or rectally. The goal was often to force not simply a confession, but a public effect, the accused rendered helpless in a way that marked them socially as corrupt or dangerous. The instrument exploited bodily vulnerability and societal shame, combining anatomy with coercive staging. Evidence. Descriptions appear in court inventories and inquisitorial notes, though exact forms vary. Some municipal accounts list payments to executioners for implements, and a handful of trial depositions reference the object by name. Forensic archaeology has limited physical confirmation. Objects were often dismantled or hidden, but the recurrence of similar descriptions across regions argues for a pattern rather than an isolated rumor. Consequence. Beyond immediate injury, permanent tissue damage, infections, lifelong humiliation, the pair served as a means to control sexual transgression narratives and enforce gender discipline through terror rather than only through spectacle. 3. The Judas Cradle. Vignette. Aldo Grimaldi's last coherent words, scrawled in a margin of a clerk's ledger, were a complaint about the chair they called the Judas seat. He was brought to a public scaffold where, according to the entry, he was placed upon a pointed seat that promised slow agony rather than sudden death. The crowd was told to look. The body of a traitor would speak to the city by its endurance. Function and mechanism. Reported in travelogues and some judicial notes, the Judas cradle is described as a tapered, conical pole upon which a victim was set. The instrument's terror lay in its promise of protracted discomfort and humiliation. Physiologically, pressure concentrated on perineal tissues produces severe soft tissue trauma, risk of infection, and long-term urogenital damage. The device's purpose combined corporal punishment, public humiliation, and the production of a confession or forced retraction.
Evidence. References appear sporadically in municipal records and foreign visitors' accounts. Some inquisitorial correspondence warns against the notorious cruelty of certain seats, suggesting they were in active use in some jurisdictions. Archaeological confirmation is rare. The evidence often comes from descriptive texts and later condemnations by reformers. Consequence. Survivors faced chronic pain, reproductive harm, and the social label of having been subjected to a punishment reserved for those portrayed as morally corrupt. For communities, the spectacle was intended as a safeguard through terror. 4. The Breast Ripper. Vignette. Agnes Bernau's name survives in a provincial docket as one of several women accused of unchaste counsel. The record notes that the sentence involved an instrument described in gruesome shorthand. A later notation by a physician records chronic infections and tissue loss. For Agnes, the brutality had a gendered signature, an instrument that literally targeted a signifier of womanhood. Function and mechanism. The so-called breast ripper was a device and category of violence designed to maim, disfigure, and mark the female body as a punishment for perceived sexual or religious transgression. Its practical aim was both punitive and symbolic. It converted the body into a lesson, transformed private anatomy into public stigma. Medically, injuries to breast tissue led to hemorrhage, infection, and disfigurement. The social consequences, ostracism, and lasting trauma were often as damaging as the physical wounds. Evidence. Court sentences, guild ledgers recording payments for devices, and medical notes from physicians who treated such injuries provide the bulk of evidence. The language in legal texts focuses on shame and social order, often justifying gender-specific punishments in terms of moral restoration. Consequence. Survivors could be physically disabled and permanently marked by community narratives that equated their bodies with moral failure. 5. Breaking on the wheel. Vignette. Peter Stump's sentence is blunt and public, to be broken and left upon the wheel. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that the crowd watched as body after body was crushed and arranged like an emblem. Some locales left the fractured bodies displayed for days as a cautionary emblem. Peter's ledger entry includes the cold note that he died before the final stage, something the clerk seems to have recorded with the regularity of a municipal expense. Function and mechanism. The wheel was both punishment and spectacle. Limbs could be broken in ways intended to prolong dying rather than hasten it. The order of strikes, the choice to leave a victim unconscious or alive, these elements were part of the judicial script. Physiologically, it produced fractures, internal bleeding, shock, and crushing injuries that often led to sepsis.
The spectacle functioned politically. The spectacle of a broken body was meant to demonstrate the sovereign's power to dismantle both body and reputation. Evidence. Municipal execution records, trial sentences, and frequent references in travel literature provide a substantial evidentiary base. Archaeological studies have identified disarticulated and perimortem fractured skeletons near known execution sites consistent with this form of punishment. Consequence. The wheel produced bodies that testified visually to the power of the courts. It also removed the accused from social life and documented suffering in ways that administrative records recorded as civic justice. Interlude A. The bureaucracy of pain and the gendered ledger. Having seen 5 methods, a pattern crystallizes. Cruelty had clerks and checklists. Torture was often authorized, recorded, sometimes regulated. Executioners' households received municipal payments. Prison logs detailed hours and supplies. Magistrates annotated confessions with procedural formulas. This is essential. The persistence and prevalence of these methods were not solely the result of rogue malice. They emerged where institutions permitted and at times encouraged standardized practices. Gender also appears as a structural variable. Instruments like the pear and the breast ripper were applied with the social language of shame. They were not random. They targeted bodies that carried symbolic weight in patriarchal social structures. The function was not simply to extract truth, but to rearrange social order,
to render visible what authorities deemed private transgression. That combination, mechanical procedure plus moral theater, turns cruelty into governance. 6. Rat torture. Vignette. In an isolated provincial jail, the record of a nocturus of rats accompanies a confession scribbled in a shaky hand. The clerk's note is matter of fact. Rats were placed to force disclosure. The accused is unnamed in the surviving lines, but the physical aftermath, fingertip erosion, clawed scars, and infected soft tissue, features in a later medical report. Function and mechanism. Rat torture took several forms, from placing animals in confined spaces against the skin to using their instinct to burrow as a means of forcing penetration into wounds or cavities. The terror was dual: the immediate, animal panic of being set upon by rodents and the anticipatory dread of what such creatures might seek in the body. Physiologically, rat attacks cause lacerations, bacterial infection, and horrifying sensations that undermined resistance. Psychologically, the presence of a live animal introduced chaos into the controlled environment of interrogation, a reminder that the body was a site of both biological vulnerability and social shame. Evidence. Court records and inquisitorial notes reference rat ordeals as practical measures. Later medical annotations on detainees report telltale infection patterns.
Archaeological deposits in certain prison sites include rodent remains associated with human burials, and forensic specialists have pointed to bite patterns and healed margins consistent with animal interaction. Consequence: beyond immediate physical injury, victims frequently suffered chronic infections, tissue necrosis, and the lingering psychological trauma of being violated by animals in a setting designed to render them utterly powerless. The Rack and the Scavenger's Daughter. Vignette. The rack is mentioned in a municipal ledger as an investment for the city's Chamber of Justice. The ravages of its use are written in the margins of trial transcripts. A later note records a woman bent like a bow and sent home half-crazed. The Scavenger's Daughter, its grim counterpart, appears in a jurist's commentary as a device that compressed and contorted rather than stretched, an inversion of the rack's principle. Function and mechanism. The rack lengthened and dislocated joints to produce pain and encourage confession. The Scavenger's Daughter, by contrast, folded the body inward to induce suffocation-like pressure, extreme discomfort, and loss of muscular control. Both techniques exploited joints, ligaments, and the nervous system to cause pain without necessarily causing immediate death. Jurists sometimes preferred one over the other, and manuals discuss their use in interrogations, with occasional admonitions about permanent injury and the limits of confession reliability. Evidence. Inventories and payment lists show the procurement of racks, chains, and blocks. Legal texts describe protocols for their use and the conditions under which an interrogation's results were to be deemed admissible. Forensic examinations of long-term prisoners revealed dislocations and healed fractures consistent with exposure to these techniques. Consequence. Repeated exposure left many with chronic joint disability, nerve injury, and a lifelong incapacity to work, another form of social death. The records show magistrates balancing a desire for confession with concern over lasting damage, which in itself proves the methodical nature of the practice. The Heretic's Fork. Vignette. A small iron rod called a fork found its way into an Inquisition's catalogue as proof of heresy's seriousness. A citizen's deposition records seeing a man arrive with a rod fixed between chin and sternum, his head immobilized, as if speech itself had been imprisoned. The object was designed to deny rest and to frame confession as a public spectacle of immobility. Function and mechanism. The Heretic's Fork prevented a person from lowering or moving the head without incurring pain, forcing prolonged upright posture that exhausted muscles, choked quiet, and created a physical constraint on sleep. The psychological effect was a steady erosion of dignity and will. As with sleep deprivation, it sought to make the accused susceptible to verbal pressure in the absence of overt beating. Evidence. Inquisitorial manuals list such restraining devices among permissible tools for controlling recalcitrant detainees. Contemporary sketches and text descriptions appear in certain trial records, and the recurrence of similar language across regions suggests a shared repertoire of instruments. Consequence. Prolonged use led to muscle atrophy, chronic neck pain, and a persistent vulnerability to panic attacks. In legal terms, testimonies obtained under such constraint increasingly drew attention to the unreliability of the confession, even when such methods continued to be deployed. 9. The knee splitter and other limb maimers. Vignette. A traveler's tale mentions a roadside execution where the accused's legs were maimed to leave him useless to the realm. The offender's name is not preserved. The record is blunt. He was maimed at the knee. The aim was to produce permanent disability as both a bodily punishment and a social marker. Function and mechanism. Devices and techniques that maimed limbs, crushing tools, wedges, and focused blows, were intended to remove capacity, the ability to flee, to labor, to marry. They converted criminal culpability into permanent physical disadvantage. This was punishment as social engineering. Communities could no longer risk the reintegration of certain bodies into civic life. Evidence. Legal codes show specific penalties calling for incapacitation. Forensic osteological surveys near medieval roadways and urban peripheries have documented peri-mortem fractures and healed injuries consistent with deliberate maiming. Consequence. Maimed individuals often became wards of charity, visible reminders of the penalties of transgression, and evidence that the legal system could mark bodies to control populations. 10. The tongue terror. Vignette. A clerk in a small archive copied a short note. For the lying witness, the tongue is punished. The language is terse. The practice, even in the records, appears almost casual. A later physician's annotation describes a man who could speak, but whose articulation was alarmingly altered by scar tissue. Function and mechanism. Punishments targeting speech, tongue cutting, partial removal, or severe biting, sought to silence and to mark. They addressed not just the body, but the social function of speech, rumor, heresy, and slander. Medically, the injuries created chronic difficulties with nutrition and communication, and left visible scars that branded a person as a liar or offender. Evidence. Legal prescriptions point to speech-related penalties in defamation cases and in trials for heresy. Medical notations and court depositions confirm the use of speech-targeting punishments in certain jurisdictions. Consequence. Victims suffered lifelong impairment of speech and diet, social ostracism, and a reduced capacity to participate in community life. Punishments designed to remove not only liberty, but also voice.
Interlude B. Professionalization, manuals, and the language of procedure. At this midpoint, the pattern intensifies. Instruments tailored to bodies, procedural notes about their use, and clerical language that treats suffering as data. Executioners and torturers in many cities appear as quasi-professionals, trained, paid, and recorded. Manuals and legal commentaries debate the admissibility of confession under torture, indicating that authorities were aware of the epistemic problems, yet often proceeded anyway. This professionalization had consequences. It produced a repertoire of accepted tools and a vocabulary for describing pain. It legitimized certain techniques even as critics condemned them, creating legal frameworks where atrocity could be debated rather than simply forbidden. The presence of payment ledgers and workshop inventories reveals that torture devices were treated as municipal property, repaired, stored, and occasionally inventoried like any other item of civic infrastructure. That bureaucratic logic also created perverse incentives. If a city had invested in a rack, there was institutional pressure to use it. If a magistrate's reputation rose by successful interrogations, colleagues emulated those methods. This is the administrative peril. Systems of power can normalize cruelty through record-keeping and routine usage. We can see across these first 10 methods a recurring architecture: instrument, administration, record. The suffering is shaped by anatomy, staged by ritual, and stabilized by bureaucracy. It is not accidental nor purely expressive. It is repetitive, trainable, and transmissible. Transition. As we move deeper into this catalog, consider 2 threads to hold in your mind. First, the use of anatomy and physiology as a tool of governance, pain engineered to produce social knowledge. Second, the gendered distribution of methods, some instruments aimed explicitly at bodies that signify certain social roles. Both threads will reappear and intensify as we encounter the next set of devices, where threats of fire, iron, and open-air execution join the list, and where legal rationales become even more explicit about confession versus proof. 11. Ear and nose removal. Vignette. A provincial ledger contains a terse entry for the cutting of the nose and ear of the woman accused of false coin. The clerk adds a payment to the barber surgeon,
the line is businesslike, as if supplies and labor were the salient facts. The woman's name is faded elsewhere in the file. What survives is a later household account noting garments purchased to conceal facial wounds. In a coroner's marginal note, a physician remarks on the difficulty of speech when breath met scarred passages. The memory of the offender survives in fragments, a face rearranged to warn the neighborhood. Function and mechanism. Facial mutilation served multiple functions at once.
It was punitive, inflicting lasting physical pain and disfigurement, but it was also civic signage. In communities where reputation and appearance structured social participation, altering visible features removed anonymity, prevented marriage, and stigmatized offenders publicly. Anatomically, wounds to soft tissues of the face carried high risks of hemorrhage and infection. Scarring altered speech and sensation. Nerve damage produced chronic pain. The logic was not merely revenge, it was a calculated social technology. Render the offender visible and mark them as permanently outside the norms the community upheld. Evidence. Legal ordinances and municipal penalties list facial maiming among prescribed sanctions for theft, fraud, and sexual offenses. Barbers and surgeons appear in payment accounts connected to penal operations, and medical notes recorded chronic complications consistent with such injuries. Forensic analysis of skeletal remains, where soft tissues are lost to time, can nevertheless show perimortem activity on nasal bones and jaw structures that align with written penalties. Consequence. Those punished in this way returned to society with bodies that functioned as living records of moral failure. The wounds were a legal instrument of exclusion as much as a physical punishment. 12. The Iron Maiden, Myth and Reality. Vignette. Accounts from early modern reformers and visiting travelers sometimes describe an iron cabinet lined with spikes that enclosed victims for slow death. A provincial pamphlet denounces the machine of iron as evidence of barbarity. Yet when municipal inventories are examined, the picture is more complex. Many towns list locks and cabinets in prisons, but not the elaborate spiked effigy popularized in later centuries. In the notated margin of one anti-torture tract, an exasperated jurist warns his readers about public fancies that distract from the quotidian cruelties actually in use. Function and mechanism. The Iron Maiden exists at the intersection of rumor, didactic horror, and occasional reality. Where it did exist in some form, its stated function was to dramatize consequence. The cabinet rendered confinement itself into a spectacle of imminent mortality. Yet historians and forensic specialists caution that the common image, a coffin lined with spikes designed to tear flesh, often owes more to later literary invention than to routine medieval practice. Instruments of confinement and restraint were real. The flourish of spikes and theatrical tableau sometimes belonged to print culture that amplified the gruesome for moral or polemical ends. Evidence. Catalans and inventories sometimes list cabinets or cages. Reformist tracts and travel narratives embellish their design. The material record for the full spiked chamber as commonly imagined is slim. Archaeological finds suggest cages and locked enclosures, but not consistently the dramatic spikings that appear in later museum pieces. Scholars rely on a combination of municipal records, moralizing literature, and sparse physical evidence to parse myth from routine. Consequence. Even as the Iron Maiden occupies a questionable place between fact and legend, its power is instructive. Stories of monstrous machines do moral work, sometimes to horrify, sometimes to deflect attention from the ordinary mechanisms of legalized harm that were far more pervasive and bureaucratically embedded. 13. Strappado. Vignette. A clerk's marginal sketch in a trial file depicts a man suspended by his wrists with a square knot and a strop. The accompanying line reads simply, "He confessed beneath the strappado." A physician's note later records dislocated shoulders and damaged rotator cuffs. The man, anonymous in the surviving ledger, left behind a signature rendered in an unsteady hand, as if the motion of pain had reshaped the script itself. Function and mechanism. Strappado operated on leverage and the weight of the body. When suspended by the arms, sometimes with weights attached to the feet, the shoulders could be strained beyond anatomical limits. Nerve impingement ensued, and pain radiated down the limbs. Strategically applied, it could produce intense but non-lethal suffering, ideally to produce swift compliance or a confession. The method also carried an implicit threat, the potential to convert soft tissue injury into permanent disability if applied excessively. Evidence. Interrogation manuals and judicial records refer to suspension methods by name, and medical annotations in trial files document the kinds of shoulder and nerve damage consistent with strappado. Forensic examination of skeletal remains from certain detention sites show healed clavicular malunions and other bone markers compatible with repetitive suspensions. Consequence. Victims often suffered chronic pain, limited mobility, and nerve damage that translated into social and economic marginalization long after the legal penalty was completed. Forkeen. Water torture. The water cure. Vignette. A magistrate's account notes the procurement of water and vessels for the interrogation of a suspect in a case of sedition. A notation in a surgeon's notebook records treatment for aspiration and a lingering cough in a man who had undergone forced immersion. Witness pages from coastal regions hint at localized practices: men tied and held with cloths, neck constrained, and water repeatedly poured or forced into the face until breathing was compromised. The accused later recanted, giving the municipal scribe the outcome that the machinery of interrogation intended. Function and mechanism. Water-based tortures took varied forms, from forced immersion to repeated, controlled pouring intended to induce the sensation of drowning. Physiologically, they produced panic, the risk of aspiration pneumonia, and severe psychological shock.
The technique exploited the body's basic reflexes, gasping, laryngeal closure, and the mind's instinctive terror before suffocation. Administratively, the method had an advantage for interrogators. It could be presented as less violent in appearance while delivering conditions that undermined resistance. Evidence. Court registers mention the water test and payments for attendants to manage such procedures. Medical notes and later legal debates show awareness of both the physical harm and the moral hazards. Confessions obtained under such duress were often contested. Forensic specialists studying historical mortality patterns highlight cases where pulmonary complications followed documented water-based coercion. Consequence. Survivors could later face chronic respiratory problems, nightmares, and a persistent association between water and threat, an inward remnant of the method's capacity to rewrite memory and testimony. 15. The burning chair. Vignette. A city record describes a chair of heat used to punish a man convicted of arson, an irony that the clerk records without rhetorical flourish. Travelers' accounts mention chairs heated to inflict pain on soles, hands, or buttocks. In some stories, the instrument was part of staged punishment where the accused clothes and limbs were singed. A hospital register later lists treatments for severe burns and gangrene among those subjected to heat-based penalties. Function and mechanism. The burning chair transformed temperature into legal sanction. Heat applied to localized areas produced blistering, nerve destruction, and risk of infection. In contexts focused on moral retribution, such as punishing arsonists or traitors, the chair functioned as a symbolic mirror. The offense and the punishment shared an elemental logic. Administratively, it was manipulable. The intensity could be adjusted, and it could be used in combination with other restraints to limit movement while pain was applied. Evidence. Payments to craftsmen for heated devices, hospital records of burn treatment, and legal ordinances that name heat-based punishments provide the documentary trail. Forensic evidence in skeletal remains is sparse for burns on soft tissue, but contemporary surgical notes and municipal correspondence corroborate the regular use of temperature as punishment. Consequence. Beyond immediate tissue damage, victims faced chronic neuropathic pain, disfigurement, and again social marking, burn scars as signatures of legal reprobation. Interlude C. Law, confession, and the administration of memory. By the time we reach the middle of the catalog, the legal logic behind these methods becomes unavoidable. Jurists debated whether a confession obtained under duress had any probative value. Inquisitorial manuals and municipal ordinances contain passages that wrestled with limits, and yet they frequently include procedures for how to carry out coercion without converting it into murder.
The same records that lamented the epistemic unreliability of tortured testimony also prescribed the instruments to be used. This contradiction matters. It reveals a juridical culture that both recognized the moral hazard of forced confession and nonetheless argued for its pragmatic utility. Manuals discuss thresholds: if a suspect fainted, if blood flowed excessively, if the suspect died, and clerks annotated such events with the weary language of municipal administration. There were auditors, payments, and replacements for worn instruments.
Sometimes reformers invoked these records in the next century to argue for legal change. Sometimes magistrates compounded their power by citing precedent. As historians and forensic archaeologists have shown, this archival bureaucracy is not peripheral, it is central to understanding why torture was pervasive. Institutional memory, orders, ledgers, inventories, made cruelty repeatable. The law did not simply authorize violence, it systematized it, recorded it, and thereby normalized it. 16. Branding. Vignette. In a dimly lit square, municipal officers held a man while a furnace-gloved mark was applied to his arm. The public identification required viewers to read the letters scorched into the flesh, an F for felon, an H for heretic, depending on jurisdiction, and the clerk later entered the fact into the criminal register. The mark became a legal shorthand. The stamped body required no further proof to categorize a person's civic status. Function and mechanism. Branding was a permanent form of legal identification and exclusion. It translated a sentence into a visible, durable code. For the judicial system, it solved the problem of proof in a pragmatic way. Anyone bearing the mark carried proof of earlier sanction. The injury itself risked infection and altered sensation, but its civic power lay in the mark's legibility. Branding shaped social mobility. It affected labor prospects, marriage potential, and the possibility of reintegration. Evidence. Legal codes articulate specific letters or symbols to be burned into the body and prescribe circumstances. Municipal account books record purchases of irons and fuel, and court entries note when a brand was applied. Forensic studies of preserved skin in rare cases, and anthological studies of legal regulations confirm branding's function and prevalence in some regions. Consequence. Beyond pain and scarring, branding produced a lifetime of surveillance, bodies that testified to prior subordination, and thus remained readable to subsequent authorities and neighbors. 17. Flaying. Vignette. A rebel named Georgi Doza in some accounts, appears in regional chronicles as a case apart, a body punished not merely for crime, but for the political message it could send when displayed. A terse legal entry records the sentence. Subsequent chroniclers explain how the skin was removed and hung as a warning.
In other files, surgeons discuss the medical impossibility of sustaining life after such treatments. Here, the legal intent was often post-mortem display rather than prolonged torture for confession. Function and mechanism. Flaying, removing skin, operated primarily as political theater. It converted a body into a quasi-heraldic device. Skin stretched and displayed around public spaces signified absolute defeat. Where applied to living victims, it induced excruciating pain and rabid systemic failure. Where applied post-mortem, it produced a permanent emblem of domination. Anatomically, the procedure was catastrophic: loss of barrier functions, massive infection risk, and irreversible shock. Its purpose in the penal repertoire was explicitly communicative. Terrified onlookers would understand the stakes of rebellion or defiance. Evidence. Chroniclers and municipal records document post-execution displays. Notes by physicians and bystanders note the physical impossibility of survival, which aligns with the practice's intended symbolic function. Archaeology sometimes recovers pickled or preserved soft tissue remnants and disarticulated remains near sites of known punitive executions. Written records frequently place flaying within the list of exemplary corporal penalties for treason. Consequence. Flaying turned dying, or the corpse, into a broadcast. For societies wanting to eliminate not just an actor but a memory of resistance, the technique was brutally effective. 18. The grot, collar strangulation. Vignette. Court papers in port cities reference a grot, a constricting collar used to punish sailors for desertion or theft. One surviving letter recounts a man found with bruised neck anatomy consistent with prolonged constriction. A physician's certificate later lists asphyxia symptoms. The practice could be rapid or extended, used as both punishment and extraction. Function and mechanism. Collar-based strangulation and constriction aim to deprive oxygen and to inflict panic. Where applied temporarily and under supervision, it functioned as a coercive tool, producing extreme discomfort and psychological breakdown. Anatomically, prolonged constriction risks hypoxic damage, risk of permanent neurological injury, and death. Administratively, collars were portable instruments that allowed punishment in private or semi-public spaces, thereby producing controlled terror without requiring the infrastructure of a rack or wheel. Evidence. Municipal logs and naval discipline records mention the use of collars and chokings. Medical notations report asphyxiation-related sequelae in those so punished. Forensic examinations of cervical structures and soft tissue markers sometimes corroborate prolonged constriction where the record specifies such punishment.
Consequence. Victims could suffer cognitive impairment from hypoxia, chronic anxiety around confinement, and social rumor that equated the person's name with cowardice or treachery, another form of civic branding. 19. Sawing. Vignette. Accounts of sawing appear in scattered chronicles and some judicial sentences. A body suspended while a saw was applied lengthwise, an image intended to graphically invert the anatomy of the human form.
A visiting chronicler in one city describes the crowd's silence as the instrument did its work. A subsequent medical letter describes rapid systemic failure. In many records, sawing is reserved for parricide or treason, crimes narratively positioned as intimate betrayals that demanded equally intimate reversal. Function and mechanism. Sawing, when it occurred, was an extreme form of execution intended to disrupt the coherence of the body. It combined spectacle and dismemberment in a way that served as the ultimate legalized inversion of social bonds. A son destroying a father's life, for example, answered by the literal unmaking of a body. Physiologically, it was rapidly fatal and horrifying. Administratively, it was reserved for the most exceptional crimes, precisely because of the depth of its affront. Evidence. Chronicles and legal codes mention sawing and lists of capital punishments for particular offenses. Forensic traces are sparse given the destructive nature of the practice, but references in multiple jurisdictions suggested functioned as a sanctioned extreme. Consequence. The social lesson was explicit. The community would physically unmake those whose acts were deemed to break the most fundamental ties. The method's rarity and extremity make it particularly resonant in the historical imagination. 20. The oubliette. Vignette. A ledger notes the construction of a narrow cell with a trapdoor, a place to forget. One line in a magistrate's file records a prisoner consigned to the oubliette, and a later account by a visitor speaks of a hollow echo where cries once rose but eventually ceased. In some hospitable climates, detention in an oubliette could be a death sentence by exposure, dehydration, or starvation. In other cases, it was a long, slow erasure of presence. Function and mechanism. The oubliette's power was the denial of narrative closure. It was a device of disappearance, a person removed from public life and literal record. Unlike more demonstrative punishments, consigning someone to an oubliette erased their social trace. Families could not mourn publicly, and the legal system could claim secrecy under the rationale of security or state necessity. Psychologically, the prospect of complete erasure functioned as punishment beyond the body, an annihilation of voice and memory. Evidence. Architectural plans of prisons sometimes include narrow cells accessed by trapdoor. Court orders sometimes specify secret detainment.
Archaeological excavations of certain fortifications reveal small subterranean chambers consistent with purpose-built oubliettes. Archival notes record payments for maintenance and construction. Consequence. Oubliettes inflicted a different kind of harm, not spectacle, but negation. They removed persons from social and legal life, producing unknown fates and a haunting absence that serves as a civic silence. Thematic synthesis, patterns at the close of the catalog. Across these 20 methods, a set of repeating logics emerges. First, there is the interplay between spectacle and secrecy. Some instruments were designed to be public, wheels, displays, branded forearms, while others were meant for the chamber. The pear, the strappado, the oubliette. Both forms serve the same systemic goals: to extract compliance, to signal authority, and to reorder social categories. Second, anatomy becomes policy. Torture practices reveal careful attention to the body's vulnerabilities, the mechanics of joints, the psychological terror of suffocation, the social function of speech and face. Often the methods were calibrated to leave testimony, confessions, public displays, and records that testified to the state's capacity to punish. This is the industrial aspect, suffering produced according to known vulnerabilities and administered in bureaucratic settings. Third, gender and social control thread through the repertoire. Instruments like the pear and the breast ripper targeted bodies with gendered meanings. The legal categories that justified them often reflected anxieties about sexuality, honor, and social order. Punishment was therefore a technology of social reproduction, not merely retribution. Finally, there is continuity. The mechanics of coercion, exhaustion, forced immersion, sensory assault, reappear in modern forms. That continuity does not flatten historical differences, but it forces us to see torture as an administrative problem as much as a moral one. If techniques adapt, then the institutional logics that normalize cruelty must be understood and challenged. Modern parallels, from medieval chambers to contemporary practices. The methods we have examined do not exist solely in the past. Many of the mechanisms, though not their exact trappings, resurface in modern detention and interrogation practices. Consider water-based techniques and their echo in terms like waterboarding, a controlled induction of the sensation of drowning that aims to bypass resistance. Sleep deprivation and enforced upright postures reappear in modern programs designed to wear down cognition. Collaring and physical restraint in tight spaces mirror stress positions and prolonged constraint. Solitary confinement and the oubliette's erasure find modern analogs in long-term isolation units where presence is minimized and memory of the detained is allowed to atrophy.
The continuity is not perfect. Legal frameworks, public scrutiny, and international human rights instruments have transformed the rhetorical and juridical landscape. Yet the administrative logic that institutions create and legitimize methods of control through manuals, records, and professionalizing roles remains an instructive parallel. Modern abuses often follow similar bureaucratic pathways: orders, memos, training, equipment procurement, and after-action reports. The ancient lesson is that when coercion is routinized and recorded, it becomes easier to normalize. Forensic archaeology and medico-legal history provide a bridge in understanding continuity. Skeletal markers, soft tissue pathology, and archival records help identify patterns of harm across time. Specialists have used these tools to demonstrate that forced confessions were often products of methodology rather than clear evidence of guilt. The presence of protocols, notes on admission and discharge, and payment registers in both medieval and modern contexts tells a cautionary tale. Documentation can be evidence not only of crime, but of the system that commits it. Ethical and political reflection. What should viewers take from these accounts? First, the catalog reframes our image of the medieval world. It challenges the tidy separation between civilized legal order and barbaric violence by showing how law and bureaucracy can both authorize and sanitize brutality. Second, it insists on the centrality of victims' dignity. Their names, their injuries, their erasures matter because historical records often turn them into data. Bringing them back into moral focus resists the bureaucratic flattening that made cruelty administrable. Finally, recognizing patterns of administrative normalization helps identify modern risks. Systems that compartmentalize responsibility and treat suffering as an instrumental output run the danger of producing harm on scale. The antidote is not sentimental nostalgia for a supposed moral past, but robust institutional accountability, transparent records, independent scrutiny, and legal frameworks that refuse to treat human bodies as instruments of statecraft. Memorializing the names. We close by returning to the people whose fragments we followed through files and marginalia. Giovanni Borromeo hangs under a palace, his body the beginning of our inquiry into the procedural nature of pain. Isabella de Cordoba's exhausted testimony shows how sleep can be weaponized. Marguerite of Lyon's brief words mark the pair's role in gendered terror. Aldo Grimaldi's ledger margin speaks for the Judas Cradle's public humiliation. Agnes Bernau's medical entries remind us of gendered violence. Peter Stump's wheel embodies public spectacle, and Gorgie Doze's fate shows flaying as political theater. These names are not mere rhetorical devices. They are reminders that the archival record is a record of persons. To study torture is to keep their suffering from vanishing into abstractions. A final reckoning, why this changes how we see history. If our image of medieval punishment was once dominated by isolated acts of cruelty, the catalog forces a different conclusion. These practices were often the product of institutions that treated pain as a resource. The tools and rituals of torture were maintained, debated, and sometimes criticized within legal cultures that nonetheless perpetuated them. That bureaucratic dimension should unsettle us. It suggests that atrocity is not just the outcome of monstrous individuals, but a potential product of ordinary organizational logic. Seeing that continuity reshapes how we read sources, how we curate museums, and how we teach the past. It invites skepticism where records claim certainty, and compassion where archives silence names. It calls for an attentiveness to the administrative traces of harm, the ledgers, the invoices, the marginal notes, that may be as revealing as the spectacle itself. If this catalog changes your view, it should also change the questions you bring to both past and present. Who wrote the records? Who profited from the instruments? Who was made invisible? And how did law serve to naturalize pain? Closing call to action. If this examination mattered to you, share it to ensure these victims are not forgotten. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and which dark corners of history you would like us to investigate next. Subscribe for careful, evidence-driven history that looks beyond artifacts and into the systems that created them. Above all, remember the names in these pages, not as objects of fascination, but as persons whose lives and suffering demand our remembrance and our vigilance against institutionalized cruelty.